is actually a bigger portion for Paul that is from verse 18 all the way to chapter 3, verse 20. In the function of this passage, we see in the word for. Okay, so starting off this passage, at least in some translations, so like the ESV has for the wrath of God. So this word is important. It confirms that faith alone is, or this passage confirms that faith alone is the only means of attaining the righteousness offered in the gospel that's stated in verse 17. So we can see the whole structure from verse 18 to chapter 3:18 as what's considered a chiastic pattern. Okay, and I have it on the screen. You'll see that it's a common format. A chiasm is a common format used by Paul, used in Semitic cultures, in which what is at the center is the most focal point of the whole. So we see a focus in Romans chapter 2, verses 17 to 29. I'm not going to focus on that today, but basically specifying how the Jews have broken God's law. So as we kind of look at that whole thing, where we look today fits into this argument. And so we see that because all people are depraved and cannot earn God's salvation by works in their own merit, this passage today will show that the Gentiles, primarily, though not exclusively, are guilty of sin. And then we see from chapter 2, verse 1 through chapter 3, 8, is to show that Jews are also equally guilty. So really, as we see, what is Paul's big argument here is that all are guilty before God, all are closed off to faith as the means by which they can obtain God's salvation, which then is part of the end of chapter 3. So the point that Paul is making through the end of verse 17 is a citation from Habakkuk: "The righteous shall live by faith." So we'll see the section, chapter 1, verses 18 to 32, could be broken down into two smaller sections. So the first, which we'll look at today, verses 18 to 23. The first deals with the basis for the guilt of the Gentiles, again, all people by extension. And then verses from 24 to 32, we'll look at the consequences or results of that guilt. So our main theme this morning is that the basis for God's wrath against humans and the fact that they are without excuse is that they suppress the truth about God and have exchanged the glory of God for idols. And our first point, and I believe you have this in your outline, the first point is the basis for God's wrath against humans and the fact that they are without excuse is that through their wickedness, they suppress the obvious truth about God's eternal power and divine nature. So the beginning of Romans 1:18 passage links again back to Romans 1:17 and shows that the section is designed to explain the righteousness of God in terms of the wrath of God. Since God's righteousness implies his fairness and impartiality, it is essential for Paul to show that God's wrath toward the ungodliness and unrighteousness of human beings is fair, and the structure of this passage helps explain that element of his wrath. So Paul basically loosed this passage in kind of four parts. This brief introduction in 18, two main parts, as I said, and then a conclusion in verse 32. So this introduction, this verse 18, is important to make the point that Paul is looking at. So really looking at why God reveals his wrath against human beings. And again, this part explains that God had good reason for doing so because he had made this truth about himself clear to human beings, and they intentionally suppressed that truth. So let me go through each verse here. Let's look at verse 18. So verse 18 is, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." So we see here that God's wrath is an expression of his righteousness because it is fair. He brings it against human beings who know the truth about him but intentionally stifle or suppress that truth. Now there's two outline points relating to this. It says God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness and wickedness of humans, and they suppress the truth about God. So as I said at the beginning of this passage, the word "for" is important. Few translations like the NIV leave that out. But it's really important because it links back to the previous passage. Now, at one level, it's understandable because it's clear that Paul is transitioning to a new point. But the link between verses 17 and 18 is too crucial to the flow of the argument to leave that unexpressed. The phrase, the wrath of God, stands in parallel to the righteousness of God. And so for Paul to use that word "for" shows that Paul clearly connecting the two, and shows that the revelation of God's wrath is to clarify in some way the meaning of the righteousness of God. And if we look at the word wrath, wrath is kind of is an old word, and it's so again, some translations call it anger. But while wrath is kind of an old-fashioned word, it is a better word than anger, because wrath preserves kind of the more objective sense of the Greek word as it applies to God. Because God's reaction to sin isn't like the anger of an emotional person. It's the necessary reaction of a holy God to sin. And so that's why wrath is better in that sense. Now, as I said, commentators frequently understood the "for" here is introducing a contrast, again, either in looking at the saving righteousness of God in verses 16 and 17, which saves people from God's wrath, or to the emphasis at the end of verse 17 on faith, apart from which people experience God's wrath. It makes sense to think of "for" here as introducing a further explanation of the righteousness of God. The wrath of God, as Paul explains then in the following paragraphs, shows that God is equitable and fair. And he reveals it against creatures who continue to suppress the truth that he has clearly demonstrated to them. Now, what's interesting is that the verbs revealed and suppress are in the present tense. And it's important for two reasons, because one, it shows that God's wrath is not merely something that will happen in the future. We see in Romans 2:5, he talks about the day of wrath as the future punishment, but it's something that also takes place in the present. There are present consequences to sin. Second, it shows that the righteousness or equity of God's wrath. So just as humans stifle or suppress the truth about God in the present, so God reveals his wrath against them in the present. So there's consequences both now and later. Let's go to verse 19. Verse 19, "For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them." And the outline point then is, what can be known about God has been made plain to them. Some knowledge of God is available to all human beings because God himself has made it clear to them. Again, there's another "for" here at the beginning. And God introduces the claim that humans suppress the truth about God. Since they cannot stifle a truth they don't understand, Paul asserts that some knowledge about God is available to them. So Paul implies by the statement that humans cannot know everything about God. They can only know as much about God as he allows them to know about him. But he has allowed all humans enough to hold them responsible for worshiping him and treating one another justly. Let's go to verse 20. Verse 20, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So the outline points, number 4, is since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature has been clearly seen through what has been made, and that humans are without excuse. Now, God is just to hold humans responsible for knowing his power and divinity because they can easily derive this knowledge from the natural world around them. Now, verse 20 explains what Paul meant when he said in the last verse of 19 that God has made what is knowable about himself visible for human beings. Now, the syntax of the statement is complex, but is reasonably clear how this all fits together. So there's a phrase, his invisible attributes is explained by the phrase, his eternal power and divine nature. And the expression, has been clearly perceived, support his point. So then the final phrase describes then in this climactic way the result of the whole statement. So they can understand without excuse. Paul himself is invisible, God himself is invisible, as we see in Colossians, as Paul states in Colossians 1, 15 and 16. But Paul maintains that God made his invisible attributes of eternal power and divinity known to people. And again, he says that they could clearly see what is unseen. So this clear vision of God's invisible attributes happened when they perceived his eternal power and divinity by means of creation. Paul doesn't explain here exactly what in the visible creation provides this knowledge of these attributes of the invisible God. But perhaps he had in mind things like fire, wind, the stars, rushing water, aspects of the beauty of creation that have been referred to as general or natural revelation. One of my favorite passages of the Bible, Psalm 19, I've spoken on that. Again, talks about God's creation. The heavens declare the glory of God and all that. So many other points in Scripture, this is clarified what is meant by that. And so Paul here states and says that this is general revelation. So let's look at verses 21 to 23. And the second point is the basis for God's wrath against humans is that although they knew God, they claimed to be wise. They neither glorified him nor gave thanks to him, but instead they became futile in their thinking, darkened in their foolish heart, and exchanged the glory of God for idolatry. Okay. So verse 21 again says, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And so this connects with the outline points here that, again, humans knew God but did not glorify him or give thanks. That's such an important thing. And they became futile in their reasoning and darkened their foolish hearts. Now, people have no logical defense before the threat of God's wrath because they knew that God deserved honor and thanks for his gifts of creation, but they refused to worship him. This unreasonable rebellion distorted their reasoning powers in other areas. Now, just as at the beginning of verse 19, the for here shows that what follows supports something that Paul has just said. And in this case, the words, they are without excuse. So he's describing why. So his explanation unfolds in 3 steps. First, he summarizes what he has just said in verses 19 to 20 about God making himself known to humans. And he does this by using this participle, although they knew God. So he's kind of referring back to that. Second, he identifies specifically the offensive behavior that he described in broad terms as ungodliness and unrighteousness. So what was that he said before? And he hinted at that at the statement when he said they're without excuse. So the problem is that human beings, despite their knowledge of God, did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. So in other words, they should enhance God's reputation by praising him. The proper response to good gifts that God has provided to everyone through his creation, therefore, is worship and thanksgiving. Third, their decision to not acknowledge God as the creator distorted their thinking. The expression to become futile in their thinking refers to a behavior that is foolish because it accomplishes nothing. It is disobedient to God and brings punishment. So this continues in verse 22. It says, claiming to be wise, they became fools. So precisely when they asserted their own wisdom, the irrational human beings who refused to worship the Creator made fools of themselves. That's what Paul is saying. Now, it's interesting, though, the phrase claiming to be was fairly common Greek for describing claims that had no reasonable basis and were untrue. The verb for claim in Greek often carried the connotation of asserting something that had no sound rationale to back it up. So you claim that to be true, but it's not really true. So the claim of which Paul speaks of here then stands in contrast to Paul's carefully reasoned argument, and itself supports Paul's argument, I just lost where I am, supports Paul's case that the failure of human beings to worship their Creator has affected their ability to reason. Okay? The picture that Paul is describing then are really babbling fools whose topic for the day is their own wisdom. You probably met some of these people, right? Especially on social media. Anyway, verse 23. And exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. So human foolishness took the form of an irrational exchange of the worship of the glorious and eternal God for images of his mortal creatures. Now, this foolishness consisted fundamentally of an irrational exchange of the most senseless and damaging kind. Humans traded away this glory of the incorruptible God. God's glory here refers to his renown, his power, his honor manifested in many ways. But in this context, Paul is probably thinking of its manifestation again in creation. We're talking about creation as displaying God's power. For example, in Isaiah 6:3, it says, the whole earth is full of his glory. Human beings should have glorified and thanked God for his immortal glory since they were beneficiaries of it. But instead they worship something else. Paul designed his descriptions of what human beings worshiped instead of God to emphasize the ridiculous nature of this exchange. Human beings worshipped images of corruptible man, birds, animals, and creeping things. Now, according to Genesis 1:26, humans were made in the image and likeness of God here. But Paul's not even saying that people are worshiping other people, but that of images resembling other people, something that God had expressly forbidden them to do in Deuteronomy 4:16. Now, as if this was not enough, not just idols of people, people moved even further from God as they gave their worship to a variety of animals. Now, Paul's list follows an order that matches animals' habitats from high to low, moving from the heavens, so birds, to just above the surface, literally four-footed animals, and then to the surface of the earth, so creeping things or reptiles. So really, in other words, far from God. So some concluding thoughts. As we consider this passage, And we think about what we studied last week, the verses 16 and 17. It says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, for it is in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. So if we consider that, then as we came to today, verse 18, comes quite a bit of surprise. It's such a big shift. Paul has just announced the theme of his letter to the Romans. The gospel is God's saving power, revealing his righteousness to all who believe. But instead of an exposition of these wonderful truths, we get dire news about God's wrath against sin. In fact, it's not until 2 chapters later, at the end of chapter 3, in Romans 3:21, that Paul finally picks up on the themes that he introduces in verses 16 and 17. And this is because only by fully understanding the bad news can we fully appreciate the good news. So let's pray. Father, I want to thank you for this good news, the gospel. And I pray, Father, that we would come to you with hearts of worship and thanksgiving, because you are an awesome God, and we thank you. And we just pray as we continue our time in worship that we would, again, place our hearts and minds in worship and thanksgiving of you. Amen.